Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that was chosen this month is handling non-deterministic loops. And don't worry, we'll get to you, I just have to set up some groundwork first. I was actually a little bit concerned when this won the Patreon voting because I already did a video about loops and shortcuts a few years ago, but fortunately, Past Dave conveniently left out one of the biggest and most significant applications of non-deterministic loops, so this time around, I know that I'll have some stuff to talk about. Let's begin with a brief review of loops and shortcuts in general and a little bit of background about why this policy exists. Let's say that we are at a competitive rel event and Amy has won game 1 of her match. She then sideboards in 4 copies of Seeker of Skybreak, and luckily for her, she draws it in her opening hand. After playing it on turn 2, she excitedly untaps on turn 3. She has the win in sight. Amy taps Seeker of Skybreak to activate its ability, targeting itself, then untaps it. She then proceeds to do this for the remaining 37 minutes of round time before passing to Nick so that he can take turn 1 of extra turns. Now, if you sit down and think about it, that's probably not the kind of experience that you want to have at a Magic tournament, but what can we do? It's entirely legal to use Seeker of Skybreak to untap itself 3,804 times in a row, and as long as Amy isn't taking too much time thinking or physically executing game actions, she doesn't meet the definition of slow play either. And so we arrive at the philosophical principle that we'll start out with today. Players are allowed to shortcut sequences of repetitive gameplay. This is the reason that loops and shortcuts are often grouped together under a single header. Players are actually required to shortcut sequences of repetitive gameplay if a loop is present. This is what stops Seeker of Skybreak from being a Tier 1 Magic staple. Once Nick points out that Amy's just doing the same thing over and over and over again, Amy is required to say a specific number of times that she will continue to do the same thing, and then we calculate the resultant game state, and then we move on with Amy being forced to do something different. Okay, well, the fun police shut down Amy's awesome deck idea, but don't worry, she's back with a new plan. She's going to play this Mesmeric Orb and use this Basalt Monolith to tap for 3 mana and then untap itself. Each time she does that, she gets to mill a card. Now Amy is going to do this 3,804 times in a row, but when the fun police come by to tell her that she has to shortcut this by just putting her whole library into her graveyard and getting back to the game, she's got a little surprise for them. See, she also has Emrakul the Eon's Torn in her deck, so guess what? We don't know how many cards Amy's going to have in her library after executing this loop 3,804 times. Sorry, Nick, guess we have no choice but to actually play it out. Hopefully we'll have time to get to a game 3. Of course, we didn't want stuff like this happening in Magic tournaments either. And that's the reason why we added this clause to the definition of slow play, which says that once a player identifies that the game is in a loop, the players involved in that loop cannot continue to execute it without shortcutting it. A loop that includes random elements, such as the one that we're considering now, is called a non-deterministic loop, and it cannot be shortcut. As an unfortunate consequence of this, the legitimate combo deck that took advantage of this interaction is de facto banned. I wish that we could come up with a solution that would allow people to still play 4 horsemen without opening the door up for malicious actors to troll the whole tournament, but until someone does, this is what we're stuck with. And yeah, speaking of stuck, what about poor Amy? All she wants to do is take an individual turn that's 45 minutes long, like she saw the pro players do on stream last week. Hey, actually, what about that? How could that Nadu deck take so long without it being considered slow play? Were the judges just so engrossed that they didn't notice how long it was taking? And, at the same time, we actually banned KCI and Second Sunrise, not because they were too good, but because their combo turns took way too long to physically execute. And there's a lot more decks that people commonly complain should be getting the same treatment. Why don't the loop rules effectively ban these decks the way they do the 4 horsemen deck? And to answer that, we'll need some help from the next philosophical principle. A sequence of repetitive actions does not count as a loop if the game state is meaningfully changing every iteration. Elsewhere in the MTR, drawing cards other than the ones being used to sustain the loop is specifically called out to constitute a meaningful change. Although a strict reading would only apply this clarification to the topic of fragmented loops, judges have uniformly interpreted it to apply to non-deterministic loops also. So that's the answer to how decks like Lotus Bloom, High Tide, Nadu are able to take such long turns involving repetitive elements without it being considered slow play. As long as the game state is meaningfully changing each iteration, the play pattern can continue. In contrast, once Emrakul shuffles a player's graveyard back into their library, the game state is probably going to be exactly identical in all relevant ways to the game state before they started milling, meaning that they cannot continue to execute that loop. A common complaint that I hear is that if allowed to continue, the four horsemen pilot is obviously going to eventually wind up in a position where they have the game state that they want, just like all those other decks. So why not just let them have it? As a brief aside, for the benefit of those who aren't familiar with the operation of that deck, such a game state would be one where 3 Narcomoebas have been milled into play, and a Thassa's Oracle and a Dread Return are in the graveyard, and the library has few enough cards in it that equates to a win, probably with just the Emrakul and maybe one other card. While it may be true that if the four horsemen player continues indefinitely, the evolution of such a game state is inevitable, it is not guaranteed to present itself after any finite number of iterations. In contrast, the Nadu or Second Sunrise or High Tide player is only ever accessing game states that have naturally arisen as a result of actual rather than theoretical gameplay. It would be nice if there were some way to discriminate between a loop that was probably going to converge to its inevitable end in a reasonable amount of iterations and one that wasn't, but then again, it would be nice if computer scientists could finally solve the halting problem, but that one doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon either. I'll admit this is one area, perhaps the area of policy with the least satisfying answers, but it's not for lack of trying. If someone could come up with a better setup that met all of the reasonable expectations that everyone has of it, then that person would be lauded as a hero. So what exactly would those reasonable expectations be? And the way I see it, these are the most important. First, the loops and shortcut system needs to prevent abuse. Someone in a lost position should not be able to take advantage of the loop and shortcut rules to draw a game. While our current policy does have some protection on this front, as seen in the Seeker of Skybreak example presented earlier, it doesn't do enough. Part of the reason that we had to ban Amelia Bedelia in Pioneer was because that deck regularly had issues with players giving Wildgrowth Walker indestructible in order to do exactly that. World Gorger Dragon was banned for several years in Legacy over similar concerns stemming from its interaction with Animate Dead. An ideal system wouldn't need to ban any of these cards because the problematic play patterns would be banned instead. All in all, I'd grade what we have now about a B on this metric. Second, players should not be barred from taking game actions that they want to take based on sound gameplay. If the intention is to drag the game out, then of course it shouldn't be allowed. On the other hand, if a legitimate in-game consideration impels a player to take an action, they should be allowed to do it. As a consequence of this, infinite combos should still be viable. Players should be able to perform and win with infinite combos without having to just rely on their opponents conceding and without having to physically perform the loop however many times it takes to accrue an insurmountable advantage. I would give our current system a B here too. Most infinite combos work perfectly well with a few notable exceptions. Third, complementary to the previous point, players should not be able to use the loop rules to do things that they would not otherwise be able to do. Loops should be a shortcut to get through gameplay faster, not a tool that players can use to make new options accessible. I would say that our current system is in the S tier by this metric. I am not aware of a single case of this becoming a concern, nor do I think that it's likely that one could come up in the future. Finally, the system should be consistent. Judges should be able to interpret and apply it consistently to any scenario that could reasonably be expected to show up in a competitive REL environment. This means, among other things, that it should have a specific set of criteria that provides a binary classification of loops into allowed or not, and that a judge should be able to use those criteria to determine what class any given loop belongs to and evaluate its final end state. As a practical matter, this should be simple enough to do that any judge of average intelligence should be able to do it. Judges already have to wear a lot of hats. Adding PhD-level mathematician to the mix doesn't seem like a reasonable ask. For this criteria, I'd give the system we have right now an A. There are a few examples of loops that are classified other than how you might intuitively expect, but actually classifying or evaluating them is relatively straightforward, and there aren't any examples that I can think of where the community of judges has been split on whether something should or should not be allowed after thoroughly debating it. To be perfectly frank, I don't think a solution exists that would get top marks in all of these ideal criteria that I've laid out, but we still need to have some policy, even if it does have a few weaknesses. And this is the best we've thought of so far. Anytime I talk about loops and shortcuts, I always get a ton of comments related to these weaknesses and how the policy around this is stupid and it needs to be fixed. In an attempt to elevate these discussions above unhelpful complaining, anyone making such a comment on this video should be prepared to suggest an alternative setup and explain how their proposed alternative improves things on one of these metrics or some other one that I haven't thought of. Let's close out with a couple of examples so that people can get some experience working with non-deterministic loops. Amy controls Omniscience and casts Petals of Insight. She observes that since the number of cards in her library is not divisible by 3, she can cast the spell over and over and over, and by manipulating the order that she puts the 3 cards back, she can eventually draw whatever 3 cards that she wants. Thus, she proposes that she should be allowed to shortcut this by just searching for 3 cards and putting them into your hand. What do you think? Okay, so before we start, I will just state that Amy is correct in saying that repeated casting of Petals of Insight is eventually able to sort your library into any order as long as the number of cards in your device is not divisible by 3. I'm not sure if this would be self-evident to everybody, especially people who don't have a strong background in algorithm development, so I'll just state this as a fact. That being the case, we only have to determine whether sorting her library this way would fall under one of the things that you aren't allowed to do while executing the loop. And there's a couple of things that I could see people potentially taking issue with. For one, here is a line from the Magic Tournament rules that says, non-deterministic loops include loops that rely on decision trees. Now, I'll be quite frank, I'm not sure what this line is meant to refer to, and neither did any of the colleagues that I consulted. For example, if there was some set of cards in play that lets you repeatedly explore for free, I don't know any judge who would say you couldn't shortcut straight to the end state where all your lands are in play and all the rest of your library is in your graveyard, even though that does involve deciding to put a card into your graveyard every time you explore into a non-land. If your deck had 4 Narcomoebas in it and you wanted to end up with exactly 3 of them in play, I can't see a judge ruling that loop would be non-deterministic either, even though it involves making different decisions based on what the game state looks like when you mill each Narcomoeba. As long as you end up with all the cards in your graveyard at the end, then it should be fine. It might be that this line is meant to disallow decision trees with inputs from multiple players, since from the point of view of a player who wants to shortcut a sequence of plays, the other player's actions aren't really within his control. I think it's more likely that the decision trees line is intended to reference this rule from the comprehensive rules, which says that a loop cannot contain conditional actions, where the outcome of a game event determines the next action that a player takes. So with our Explore Narcomoeba example, this would mean it is not possible to shortcut to a game state where the player has 3 Narcos in play with some number of cards remaining in their library, and then stop. So bottom line, even though the Omniscience Petals of Insight loop does require making decisions, that doesn't by itself mean you can't shortcut it. Well, here's another potential issue. If we bring up that rule from the IPG again, it says that it is considered slow play if a player continues to execute a loop without being able to provide an exact number of iterations and an expected resulting game state. The expected resulting game state is fine, but what about the exact number of iterations? And okay, this is one that I feel kind of bad saying because it's kind of a cop-out, but here you go. It is a fact that there exists some finite number which bounds the number of times you will need to cast Petals of Insight in order to stack a deck of end cards however you want. In 2015, a judge on our forums calculated that this number was 410,758 for a 60-card deck and stated this result without proof. From then on, everyone just went with it. Because the forum post gave no information about how this number was calculated, I'm not really in a good position to check whether it's correct, nor whether the figure is different for different starting library sizes, which I suspect is the case. But a very interesting thing happened, and I know this next part will be very disappointing for some of you, but here it is. The judge program collectively decided that that was good enough. We all just decided to stick our fingers in our ears and say, la 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 la, I can't hear you, anytime someone pointed out that it says in the rules you have to state the exact number of times that you are executing the loop. Or anytime someone asked whether there was any chance that for a different library size, the number of excess iterations might not line up exactly with how many cards there were. Or that the humans involved almost certainly could not describe the game actions that they would need to take during those 410,758 castings in order to get to the end state without some help from a computer. Eventually, the requirements were relaxed further such that the player didn't even need to know what a bubble sort was or memorized some special 6-digit number that may or may not be accurate. They just needed to know that all of the judges had agreed that it worked. And so an official ruling was issued stating exactly that. I've listed some references in the description if anyone would like to check my sources. For a fun project, the mathematically inclined viewers are invited to try to find a closed form expression for the number of Petals of Insight casts that would work for various library sizes up to 60. Anyone who publishes such an expression with sufficient rationale for me to critique your work will be the proud recipient of as many honorary Frank Karsten points as I'm authorized to bestow. Now, I'll confess it does really nettle me that the CR, IPG, and MTR all have different and in some cases conflicting information about how loops are handled. Almost as much as it does when I have to tell people about a 10-year-old post in order to justify my rulings. If I was in charge, this is among the first things that I would try and smooth out, but until then, here's some general advice. It seems to be that in order to be shortcutting a loop, your loop has to have a clearly defined end state, B, it must be certain to achieve that end state within some finite number of iterations, and C, it must be possible, at least in principle, to calculate how many iterations that will be. And then, of course, you also need to convince a judge that you personally could eventually reach that goal end state. And I think that does a pretty good job wrapping up that scenario. Next, let's consider this. Amy uses some combo that allows her to cast an unbounded number of spells. Then she casts a Brain Freeze, pointing all the copies at Nick, except Nick has an Emrakul in his deck. What happens? Now, your first thought might have been to say that this looks pretty similar to the situation that we covered earlier involving Basalt Monolith and Mesmericorp. And there are some similarities, but there is one key difference. Amy legitimately put all those Brain Freezes on the stack. Once we find out that we're in a loop, we can't just wave a magic wand and make the other 3,803 copies go away. This is definitely non-deterministic because it's unknown how many Brain Freezes there will be on the stack after any given resolution of an Emrakul trigger. And yes, this is kind of a worst case scenario. There's no accurate way to shortcut it, nor any practical way to play it out, nor any reasonable way to preclude it from happening. I made a video about how to handle situations like this a few years ago, and I recommend that you check that out if you'd like to get more into the philosophy behind such scenarios. Suffice it to say, they're more about problem-solving ability than magic rules and policy knowledge. In that spirit, I'd like to propose a solution based on one that I read from Magic Policy writer and former L5 Toby Elliott. Any finite number of Brain Freezes will yield some finite total number of Emrakul triggers. Let's allow all but one of those Emrakul triggers to resolve. In the game state, immediately after the previous one resolves, we'll have some number of Brain Freezes still on the stack. This number must be at least 2, and it's bounded above by some number that's determined based on the number of total cards in the player's graveyard and library, N. The formula on screen comes from the fact that in the worst case scenario, that would involve one Brain Freeze that actually mills the Emrakul, which would immediately be preceded and followed by a string of additional Brain Freezes of the maximum possible length without milling it. For those keeping track at home, I'm giving myself one honorary Frank Karsten point for deriving this expression and another for knowing how to use LaTeX. From here, we can shuffle the graveyard and the library together and argue about what is the most fair number of Brain Freezes to assume remain on the stack. Perhaps we should use the lower bound of 2, perhaps the upper bound that we calculated earlier from that formula, or perhaps some intermediate designed to represent the expected value. In any case, we have reduced the scenario to a human feasible number of Brain Freeze resolutions in order to physically perform. If the Emrakul appears more than once during this process, so be it. This is just an approximation after all. And now, the moment that you've all been waiting for, the Gitrog Monster. For those of you not familiar with this loop, we'll assume that you have the Gitrog Monster and some discard outlet such as Wild Mongrel in play. In that case, you can discard this Stackmore Salvage, which will cause the Gitrog Monster to trigger so that you can draw a card. Replace drawing this card with Dredging 2, and you can repeat this process to mill your whole library. Except you won't mill out because you're playing Emrakul to shuffle your graveyard back into your library. Actually, Emrakul is banned in the format that this deck is played in, so maybe we should use this Kozilek instead. Well, what's the point of all this? Every land that you dredge on your way to that Kozilek will draw you a card off the Gitrog Monster, and after enough finagling, you'll have drawn your whole deck. From there, you can probably find some way to win the game somehow. From what we've talked about before, you should have no trouble identifying this as a non-deterministic loop. Discarding, dredging, and repeating will eventually draw your whole deck, but because the graveyard is getting shuffled in, there's no way to calculate exactly how many iterations that will take. There is one important difference between this loop and the Four Horsemen loop, though, which is that the game state is meaningfully changing. Recall that rule that if you're executing a non-deterministic loop and you reach a game state that's identical in all relevant ways, you have to stop. Every time you draw a card, or even every time a non-Dackmore salvage land goes to your graveyard and causes a Gitrog trigger, that resets your clock because the game state has been successfully advanced. I don't know how many times you would need to pump your Wild Mongrel before I stopped considering a change to its stats to be meaningful, but it would be quite a lot. So it is a non-deterministic loop, but it cannot be shortcut, and you're also allowed to keep performing it as long as you're continuing to advance the game. In practice, many players agree to shortcut this loop by having the Gitrog Monster player just draw their whole deck right off the bat. Officially, the other players could insist that this process be played out manually, but this serves little purpose other than to waste everybody's time. If it were my event, I would allow the Gitrog Monster player to draw their whole deck and proceed from that point, but with the caveat that if you wanted to do this, you would have to reveal all the cards that you were drawing. My rationale for this is that if you were to execute this loop manually, most of those cards would be in your graveyard at some point, so I think that's a fair compromise. Whew. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you again so much to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.